the previous video, you learned a little bit about imaginary numbers. So, an imaginary number is defined as I squared equals -1. So I is what we call the imaginary unit. That also means that the square root of -1 is equal to I. We can use this information to simplify radicals that we couldn't have before when we were just using real numbers. All right, what you want to do is you want to break your radical into different parts so that you can simplify it. So, for example, in number 1, it says the square root of -36. Okay, so how does that work? If we think of just the square root of 36, hopefully you're thinking, well, the square root of 36 is just 6. So what do I do with this negative? All right, so what we want to do is kind of use the little definition that we have up on the top here. We're going to break this down into -1 times the square root of our 36. And just think of it as two small parts. The square root of -1, according to our definition, is just I. The square root of 36 is 6. All right, usually, just like when we're using variables, we like the number in front. So usually we would write this as 6I. Okay. Example number 2 kind of looks the same. Again, we see this negative sign here. So I'm going to break it apart. We're going to take that square root of -1. All right, now this one, the square root of 5. 5 does not have any perfect squares in it. Okay, so there's really not much I'm going to be able to do with that. The square root of my -1, again, is my I. And the square root of -5 has no perfect squares, so we are just going to leave that as I times the square root of -5. We don't want to punch this in the calculator and write random decimals. Example number 3. We have the square root of a -18. So again, we're going to break this down. We have -1. All right. And now I want to think about how I can break down 18. It is not a perfect square like our 36 that we had up there. However, it does have a perfect square as a factor. So I'm going to think of this as 9 times 2. All right. Again, 9 being my perfect square. Now, there may be other factors of 18, but you want to look for numbers that are perfect squares. All right. So now that I have my little parts, I'm just going to kind of work down the line. The square root of my -1 is I. The square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 2 is just going to be the square root of 2. All right, final answer. Again, usually we put the number in front. I would write this as 3I times the square root of 2. All right, and last one. Okay, think about how we can maybe break down the 75. I take my little -1. All right, and again, there's lots of different ways that I could break down 75. You want to think of numbers that might be perfect squares. So when I think of this, I'm thinking of 25 times 3. All right, working our way down the line, the square root of -1, that's our I. The square root of 25 is 5. Square root of 3, can't do anything with that part. All right, so my final answer, 5I times the square root of 3.